W Polsce tylu szarych żołnierzy, naszych żołnierzy kochamy dziś. Jest siwy żołnierz tam w Belwederze, do niego bierze dziś polska myśl. W jesieni wieku jak kwietne lato.
Warsaw, 1939. With tensions growing between Poland and Germany, the Nazis staged a surprise attack from the air, ground, and sea, simultaneously unleashing the world's first blitzkrieg or lightning war. During the next 4 years, the Poles are ruthlessly oppressed, many are killed, and the first stages of the Holocaust begin. Warsaw, 1944. Hundreds of thousands of innocent Poles have been slaughtered, but the citizens refuse to be defeated. The Poles have been through struggles before and have a fiercely independent spirit. They fight back. During the heroic Warsaw Uprising, the Polish underground organized their small but mighty army and valiantly fought the occupation to try to win back their country. While the Poles were able to successfully organize and stage an uprising against the occupation forces to liberate their country in mid-1944, ultimately the uprising ended in tragedy when Stalin betrayed them and the Western Allies, which resulted in the deaths of the leaders of the Polish resistance and Stalin's subjugation of Poland, which then became a communist puppet state during the Cold War. During these years of horrific oppression, multiple small underground resistance groups formed and fought back when they could. By February of 1942, a Polish underground home army called the AK was formed that became the main resistance army. Their allegiance was to the Polish government in exile. The members of the resistance were unified by their dream of driving the Germans out of Warsaw and Poland. Led by General Komorowski, the Polish soldiers in Warsaw had been rehearsing their plan of revolt for 3 years and saw their chance for freedom on August 1, 1944, when the Warsaw Uprising began. Using their underground radios, the AK heard a rebroadcast on the airwaves that echoed a message that came straight from Stalin's radio in Moscow on July 15, 1944, in which the words, "The hour has struck," were transmitted, inciting the AK to schedule their attack for August 1st.
The Polish army now entering Polish territory has been trained in the USSR. It unites with the People's Army to form the body of the Polish Armed Forces, the backbone of our nation in our struggle for independence. The sons of Warsaw will rally to its ranks tomorrow. For Warsaw, which did not yield but fought on, the hour has struck.
With the Nazis preoccupied with the approaching Red Army, 40,000 underground soldiers took part in the uprising. Although they were weak from hunger with only 2,500 weapons with a 7-day supply of ammo, they had the resolve and will to rise up against their oppressors. They were desperate to retake their land. They believed the time was right to liberate Poland from Nazi rule. The attacks by the Poles on August 1st completely surprised the Germans, and the Poles managed to capture many German weapons. Victorious in their first 2 days of battle, the AK quickly seized 3 big areas in Warsaw. Dumbfounded, the Germans were unable to act quickly to prevent the initial uprising. The Poles, a determined and desperate people, held their positions with their limited supply of ammo. During this time, the Poles had messaged the Allies for supplies and had received word that ammo and supplies would be dropped by air. They waited. With the captured German weapons and expected Allied supplies, the Poles were hopeful that this uprising would be the needed turning point to take back their homeland. The brave Home Army knew this rebellion was their only hope to preserve their lives, city, culture, way of life. The time was now to sacrifice it all. Inspired by the radio address at the coordinated time, they began spilling out into the streets, shooting the enemy with their stolen weapons. Young and old alike put their lives on the line, knowing if they failed, death and further destruction of their beloved city would follow. Their will to take back their city seemed to be their last hope. Each one gave it their all. With very limited communication at this time, the Poles had made their best guess to strategically time their attack. However, what they did not know was that there was no way that the Red Army could have reached Warsaw in the first week of August. The AK's initial triumph turned tragic when the Germans regrouped, reorganized, and were soon fighting back with a new rage that the Poles had not seen before. By August 3rd, the Poles were outnumbered by German troops and military machines that would ultimately bring utter destruction to the city of Warsaw. Meanwhile, the Allies had been prevented by the Red Army from dropping the expected ammo to the Polish resistance. In a strategic betrayal, Stalin had withdrawn his previous promise for the Western Allies to use the Soviet airfields for Allied air missions. Meanwhile, Stalin had allowed the Red Army to stop advancing so his troops could rest and reorganize before their next major offensives. Therefore, the Red Army served as no distraction nor backup to the Poles as they had hoped. The Germans were then virtually unstoppable as they orchestrated and completely obliterated the city of Warsaw in punishment for the uprising. Hitler reacted to the uprising by appointing SS General Obergruppenführer Bock-Saluzki to be the commander of the German forces in Warsaw. An intense general whose troops were guilty of committing extensive atrocities on the Eastern Front, Bock-Saluzki was an expert in fighting resistance movements behind the front line. By the end of the uprising, 90% of Warsaw's buildings, roadways, and cultural icons were bombed, burned, or stolen by the Germans out of retaliation. According to Polish historians, 150,000 Poles were killed in the uprising. 22,000 of those deaths were part of Komorowski's army. Bock-Saluzki claimed that 26,000 Germans were killed. In addition to the deaths of the majority of Home Army troops, the Nazis were ordered to kill innocent Warsaw citizens to cleanse the city. Ordinary people who had already been through so much, including the elderly, women, and children, were now either killed on the spot or rounded up and shipped off to concentration camps, which was in itself a death sentence. Hitler had no qualms about the violence meted out to the civilians of Warsaw. Although the uprising was intended to liberate Warsaw, instead it was the impetus that sped up the decimation of the city and revealed Stalin's true motives. As the Nazis began to lose control and the Red Army pursued expansion, Warsaw was victimized once again as the country was subjugated by Stalin.
Poland and slaughtered its population. Helped by the Allies, the Polish underground continued to resist enslavement. Today, Poland is once more independent and free. This is how the capital of Poland looked on the day of its liberation in January 1945. The history of Poland had never before seen such devastation. Polish soldiers entering from the east are greeted and cheered by the survivors.
After the war, the Red Army stayed behind to keep Poland as a buffer as a security measure in case of another land invasion. Although Stalin had supposedly agreed to allow Poland to rule itself, anti-communists were persecuted during the 1947 national elections, so the communist government gained power and Poland became a Soviet puppet state. Local Polish communists ruled the war-torn country, but Moscow called all the shots. For the next 4 decades, Poland was a pawn in the Cold War, and the Poles saw many protests, eventually founding of an organized labor movement under Lech Walesa called Solidarity, which protested for better wages, working conditions, and economic opportunities. The Cold War's demise saw Poland transition gradually into a Western-modeled democratic political system. 1989. Communism falls in Eastern Europe. Archiving Poland's past triumphs and tragedies through the creation of museums to house the acquisition of stolen artifacts and icons ensure new generations will know Poland's story. The story of the Warsaw Uprising is one to be revered and the sacrificial Poles who participated to be respected. Unified, strong, patriots, the Poles serve as an inspiration for future generations to come.
Niech się nikt dzisiaj nie gniewa za to, gdy piosenka prostą okaże się.